"Don't close your eyes," the general whispered in the rain, as he broke every rule for her American historical drama. Reconstruction Era, 1868, Charleston, South Carolina.
This channel produces historical fiction inspired by the American Reconstruction Era, 1865-1880. All dialogues, characters, and situations are fictional and reflect the social tensions of the period. They do not represent the values or opinions of this channel. Our purpose is to honor history through emotional storytelling.
War never ends, it just settles within.
Charleston, 1868. The war ended 3 years ago. The wounds did not. The city still breathes in ruins, iron fences draped in wisteria, burned lots where mansions once stood, widows who learn to keep their faces still in public and fall apart only behind closed doors. Eliza Voss is one of them. Not a widow, but something close to it. A woman who watched the world she was raised in dissolve and built herself a new one out of practicality and silence, because those were the only materials left. She did not ask for a border. She did not ask for the army to come to her door. And she certainly did not ask for him, General Marcus Hale, commanding officer of the 2nd District, a man built from discipline and consequence, who arrived at her house with 2 trunks and a sword, and something in his eyes she had no name for yet. He is everything the street will punish her for. He follows every rule he has ever been given, because rules were the ladder he climbed when nothing else was available to a man like him, in a country like this, in a time that had not yet decided what it was willing to be. He will break every single one of them for her. This is not a story about a war. It is a story about 2 people who found each other in the rubble after one, and chose with their eyes wide open to build something the rubble had never seen before. If this story already has its hands around your heart, hit subscribe right now and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Let's begin. The house on Rutledge Avenue had once been the finest on the street. That was before the war stripped it of its silver, its horses, its men, before the fighting moved through like a tide that had no interest in what it drowned, before Eliza Voss's father died at Chickamauga with nothing but a letter in his coat pocket, a letter she had read so many times that the folds had gone soft as worn cloth, the ink fading to the color of old bruises. Now it was 1868, and the house stood the way Eliza stood, straight-spined, proud in the facade, quietly falling apart in the places no one was allowed to look. She was 24 years old, unmarried. She had the kind of self-possession that people in Charleston mistook for coldness, because it was easier to call a woman cold than to acknowledge that she had simply run out of the luxury of being warm where it couldn't be afforded. She kept the books, managed the kitchen, tended the garden, and sat with her mother in the evenings reading aloud until her mother's eyes closed, and she could finally set the book down and be alone with the silence she would never allow herself to call grief. The parlor smelled of beeswax and old wood. The curtains, the good ones, the ones her mother had embroidered before her eyes gave out, had been taken down and replaced with plain cotton. Practical. Eliza had become, above all things, practical. She heard the horses before she saw them. 3 riders coming up the avenue in the late afternoon light, the gold of their buttons catching the sun like small flames. Union blue. She recognized the cut of the uniforms immediately, the way the jackets sat on the shoulders, the particular posture of men who had won and knew it. Behind them, a wagon with 2 trunks and a folded American flag snapping in the harbor wind. She set down her mending. She did not hurry. She smoothed the front of her dress with one deliberate pass of her hand, the way she smoothed everything before she had to face it, and went to the door before they could knock. The first officer was young, a lieutenant, pink-cheeked, hat already in hand before she even opened the screen. He had the eager, slightly nervous expression of someone who had been warned about her. "Miss Voss?" "Lieutenant Aaron Gale, ma'am. We have a letter from Colonel Pratt regarding—" "I know what the letter says." She had memorized it. "General Marcus Hale, commanding officer of the 2nd District, will require quarters from the 1st of April through the duration of his assignment. You will be compensated at the standard rate." Standard rate. As though a standard rate could repay what it cost a woman of her position, in a city of her history, to house the men who had remade her world without her permission. She stepped aside. Bring the trunks to the east room. Mind the stairs. The third step is loose." The lieutenant nodded with visible relief at the cleanness of the instructions. She did not look at the wagon. She did not look at the third rider, who had not dismounted yet, who sat his horse with the particular stillness of a man who was letting the moment arrange itself before he entered it. Then he swung down. He was taller than she expected, broader through the shoulders. He moved the way certain men move, and not with performance, but with the settled economy of someone who has learned not to waste anything, including motion. The rank on his collar said everything the letter had declined to, 2 stars, a major general. But what the rank did not say, what no letter from Colonel Pratt had prepared her for, was the face. It was not a handsome face in the easy, conventional sense. It was a face that had been places, angular, brown-skinned, a jaw set as though against something permanent. A thin scar ran from his left temple to the top of his cheekbone, pale against the warm brown of his skin, catching the late light like a seam in old leather. She had not been told he was a black man. The understanding settled over her in stages. First the simple fact of it, then the weight. In 1868, Charleston, a black Union general quartered in a white Southern woman's home, was not merely unconventional. It was a calculated provocation, whether intended as one or not, to her neighbors, to the old families, to the shadowy groups that still moved through the city's edges after dark, emboldened by grief and ideology, convinced the war's outcome required correction. Her heart did not quicken with fear. It quickened with something more complicated, the awareness that she was standing at the hinge of something, that the next few seconds were going to require the truest version of herself she possessed. Colonel Pratt had known precisely what he was doing when he omitted it from the letter. General Hale walked toward her. He did not rush. His eyes found hers without apology and without challenge, simply with the level, clear attention of a man who had looked at a great many difficult things and had not looked away from any of them. He was doing her the courtesy, she realized, of being looked at the same way. "Miss Voss." His voice was low, unhurried, the accent Midwestern and carefully controlled, scrubbed of anything that would give her easy purchase on his origins. "I appreciate the accommodation. I'll require minimal disturbance." She was a practical woman. She had decided that years ago, and she intended to keep the decision. "Supper is at 7, she said. "Breakfast at 6:30. I don't cook on Sundays." "Understood." She stepped back. He walked past her into the house, and in the half-second of his passing, she caught unwillingly the smell of him, wool and leather and something dry like cedar, and underneath it, something quieter and warmer that she had no intention of identifying. The screen door swung shut behind him. Eliza stood on the porch alone. Her hands were folded at her waist. Her face was composed. She listened to his boots on her floorboards, measured, unhurried, entirely certain, and told herself the slight disruption in her breathing was nothing more than the effort of having been professional under pressure. She was very good at naming things incorrectly when it was convenient. 3 months. She would manage 3 months the way she had managed everything else, quietly, stubbornly, with her jaw set, and the door to the room of things she couldn't afford held firmly shut. She was about to discover that General Marcus Hale had very patient hands. He ate with a book open beside his plate. She found that more unsettling than she had prepared herself for. She had built, over the 4 days before his arrival, a precise mental portrait of the man she expected. The triumphant condescension she had seen in Union officers who walked through Charleston as though it existed for their education. The studied blindness to the human cost of the thing they represented. She had built the portrait because it was easier to tolerate an archetype than a person, and she had intended to keep him an archetype for the entire duration of his stay. He had ruined it by reading Frederick Douglass at supper and asking her, without looking up from the page, whether she thought the new constitutional amendments would hold. "I think," Eliza said, setting the breadbasket on the table with more deliberateness than necessary, "that you are asking the wrong woman in the wrong city." He looked up then, those dark, unhurried eyes, finding her across the table with an attention that was almost clinical. Almost, but with something underneath it that was not clinical at all. "I'm asking the woman whose answer I can't predict." She did not know what to do with that sentence. She left the dining room instead, carrying her discomfort out like a lamp. She told herself the warmth in her face was irritation. She was an excellent liar when the audience was only herself. It rained for the first 4 days of April. Charleston rain, dense and warm, carrying the smell of the marsh, the salt flats, the memory of all the springs that had come before this one. It drummed on the tin porch roof in a rhythm that made the evenings feel sealed off from ordinary time, suspended in something older and more honest. Eliza sat in the parlor and mended by lamplight. General Hale worked at the desk in the east room with his lamp burning past midnight, and the occasional sound of his pen crossing paper came through the wall between them like the steady beat of something alive. She tracked it without meaning to. The scratch of the pen, the brief silences, the sound of pages turning. She knew when he stopped for water. She knew, somehow, the difference between the silence of a man thinking and the silence of a man asleep. She did not examine this knowledge. She filed it in the room with the other things she was not examining. On the 5th night, she heard a sound she had not expected. A sharp, controlled intake of breath. Then the particular silence of a man refusing to make any more noise than absolutely necessary. She was in the hallway with a candle. She had been to her mother's room to check the window latch in the wet, when she heard it again. She stopped outside the east room door and stood in the dark with the candle cupped in both hands, and the practical part of her said to continue walking, and the other part, the one she was not supposed to be listening to, knocked twice. General Hale. A beat. Miss Voss. The window latch sticks when it rains. The room gets cold. She paused. I should have told you earlier. Another pause, longer, textured with something. It isn't the cold. She opened the door. He was seated on the edge of the bed, still in his trousers and shirt. The shirt untucked and the sleeves rolled to the elbows, his left hand braced on his knee. His right hand was pressed over the left side of his chest, just below the collarbone, and she could see even in the unsteady candlelight the controlled, deliberate labor of each breath, the kind of breathing that is not natural but constructed, a man building each inhalation by decision. Old wound, he said. Flat, informational. A door held exactly at the width required to confirm a fact and no wider. She came into the room anyway. Petersburg, he said before she could ask. 64. It doesn't trouble me in dry weather. I know what damp does to old wounds. She set the candle on the nightstand and went to the wardrobe, where she had placed a spare quilt on his first night. Thin wool, clean, smelling of cedar from the chest. She brought it back and held it out. He looked at the quilt. He looked at her. The expression on his face was one she had not seen before. Not the composed public face, not the focused attention of supper. Something stripped back to a simpler material, like a house with all the exterior paint worn off, just the wood. Sit forward, she said. He sat forward. She arranged the quilt around his shoulders with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency she deployed for everything that threatened to become something more. Tuck here, smooth there, no lingering allowed. But as she pulled the edge across his back, her fingers met unavoidably a long ridge of scar tissue, diagonal, beginning below his right shoulder blade and running to the base of his spine. She had not expected it. She had no time to prepare a neutral response. Her hands stopped. He went completely still beneath them, every muscle, every breath held. The candle flame pushed at its own shadow. She stepped back. I'm sorry, she said. The apology was not only for the inadvertent touch, it was for the whole freight of what that scar implied, the history written into his body without his authorship, the world that had decided his flesh was territory. He turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. In the angled light his face was shadow and plain, the scar at his temple catching the gold of the candle, his eyes holding something she would have needed a longer vocabulary to name accurately. Don't be, he said. Quietly, not dismissing the apology, releasing her from its weight. The draught from the window moved the flame. The shadows rearranged themselves. Eliza picked up the candle. She was careful to keep her face toward it, so he would not see what she was doing with her expression. Good night, General. Good night, Miss Voss. She walked back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark without lighting her own lamp, her hands folded loosely in her lap, and she sat there for a long time. longer than the situation warranted, longer than a practical woman should have sat, while her heart did something deliberate and specific, and entirely without her permission. April deepened into May, and Charleston bloomed the way it always bloomed, aggressively with the slightly defiant beauty of a city that had been told its best days were behind it and had decided to disagree. Wisteria heavy on the iron fences, jasmine threading through the cracks in garden walls, the magnolias opening in the churchyards like white declarations. Eliza stopped pretending she did not listen for his footstep on the stairs. She told herself it was attention to the house's schedule. She was a creature of routine. She had to be, the household demanded it. But there was a difference, and she was honest enough in private to acknowledge it, between the necessary tracking of the household's rhythms and what she was doing now, which was knowing without looking up from her book the precise moment that the east room door opened, the precise weight and pace of his step going down the hall. The difference between the sound of him leaving for the garrison and the sound of him simply moving through the house. She knew the hour he put out his lamp. She knew when he went to the window. She knew with a specificity that appalled her that on Tuesday evenings he stood on the back porch for approximately 10 minutes before coming inside, and that during those 10 minutes, the light on the garden was a particular quality of gold that she had found herself going to the kitchen window to confirm, for no reason she was willing to examine. She was appalled at herself. She was well practiced at being appalled at herself and continuing anyway. They had settled into a careful choreography of evenings. She in the parlor, he at the desk, the door between them open, not by declaration, but by the gradual, mutual, unacknowledged agreement of two people who had discovered that the door felt wrong when it was closed. He had stopped asking political questions and had begun asking other things, what the house had looked like before the war. Whether the harbor had always been this color at dusk, a blue going to gray at the edges like something slowly deciding to become sky. What the magnolias smelled like in July. She answered in short, measured sentences. She gave him facts. She did not give him the things that lived under the facts, the weight of all those smells and colors and sounds, the way the July magnolias were something she associated with her father reading on the porch on evenings that no longer existed. He listened with his full attention, book closed, pen set down, his dark eyes on her face as though her words were information he needed to file accurately, to map with care. She had never in her life had the experience of a man listening to her, as though what she said was the most consequential thing in the room. She found it, in equal measure, wonderful and terrifying. The evening of May the 14th unmade several things she had carefully made. Colonel Pratt had organized a formal dinner at the garrison, an attempt at the kind of social civility that everyone understood was performance and everyone also understood was necessary. 8 officers and an equal number of invited local families, the city in its best clothes pretending at a peace that was still being negotiated in the streets. Eliza had been included as a concession to the Voss name, which still opened certain doors regardless of the state of the Voss finances. She wore her mother's dove-grey dress, the one with the black velvet at the cuffs and collar, altered twice since the war, still beautiful in the way of things that have survived by absolutely refusing to give up being themselves. She dressed her hair without help, which took 3 attempts and 2 hairpins she couldn't find, and one moment where she stood at the mirror and told her reflection firmly to be practical and get on with it. She came down the stairs 10 minutes late and entirely composed. Marcus was in the entrance hall, full dress uniform, dark blue coat, gold braid on the shoulders, white gloves, the sword at his hip. He had the upright stillness of a formal military portrait, the kind of containment that spoke of long practice, at presenting a face designed to convey authority and nothing more personal. Then he turned, and she came down the last 4 stairs, and she watched something happen in his face that she was not supposed to see. A fractional shift, a loosening around the eyes, an expression that lasted approximately 2 seconds before he brought it back under discipline. "You look—" He stopped. "Late," she supplied. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like a smile that had presented itself and been immediately recalled to propriety. "I was going to say formidable," he said, "but yes, also late." She almost smiled back. She looked at his second button instead. At the garrison dinner, she sat 3 seats from him. She felt the distance as a physical thing, a pressure on her sternum, as though something in her was leaning toward him across the table at a cellular level and had to be continuously corrected. She had intelligent conversation with Colonel Pratt's wife about the state of the city gardens. She listened to the planter to her left drink steadily without speaking. She ate her supper and was a model of composed Southern grace and spent the entire meal acutely, helplessly aware of exactly where Marcus was seated, which way he was facing, and whether his glass was empty. After supper, the rugs were moved back for dancing. She was standing near the tall windows with a glass of sweet tea she was not drinking when he appeared at her side. Not the lieutenant, not the colonel. Him, appearing with the same quiet certainty with which he did everything, the way weather arrives simply there when it wasn't before. "I don't waltz," she said before he could open his mouth. "I wasn't going to ask you to waltz," he said. There was a pause, carefully measured. "I was going to ask if you wanted air." She looked at him. He offered his arm, correctly, formally, exactly as an officer should, elbow crooked, expression neutral, nothing in the gesture that anyone watching could call anything but courtesy. She took his arm. They stood on the garrison steps in the warm May dark, the sound of the fiddle coming through the open doors behind them, the harbour 2 streets over going silver-black under the early stars. She became aware, with the gradual inevitability of water finding the lowest point, that her hand was still resting in the crook of his elbow, that he had not moved away, that they were standing close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his uniform coat, that she could hear his breathing steady and quiet beside her, that the harbour light was moving on the water in exactly the way it had looked. For all 30 years the harbour had existed, and yet tonight looked like something she was seeing for the first time. "I lied," he said quietly. "I do waltz." She looked up at him. "General, Marcus," he said, as though testing whether the word would break something, then with a slight correction of his own expression, "if you're willing." The fiddle played a slow, careful waltz through the open doors. The harbour went on being beautiful, and everything in her, every rule she'd inherited, every wall she'd built from the rubble of the past 5 years, every careful piece of practical self-management she'd assembled since the horse came home without her father, leaned quietly against this moment and presented a question she had no practical answer to. "Eliza," she said. He looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, his face was the unguarded one, the one from the East Room, from the quilt and the candle and the scar, open and enormous and weighted with something she recognized because she had been carrying the same unmapped thing herself for weeks. He did not take her hand. He did not ask her to dance. They stood on the garrison steps and let the music move through them like current through water, and something between them, some last careful fiction of mere practicality, quietly and irrevocably dissolved. June came in with thunder. Eliza woke to it at 2 in the morning. A real Charleston storm, the kind that made the oak trees bow and the shutters rattle against their latches, rain driving sideways across the veranda, lightning turning the garden and the street and the harbour all one colour for a second before dropping them back into dark. She lay still and listened to the house, the particular symphony of creaks and sighs it made in heavy weather, each one familiar enough to be almost comforting. Then she heard the East Room door, footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, going toward the window at the far end. She listened to them stop. She lay still for another moment, staring at the ceiling, having a quiet internal argument with herself that lasted approximately 45 seconds before she lost it. She pulled on her wrapper and went to the hallway. He was at the end of the corridor, standing at the tall window that looked out over the back garden. Still dressed. He was always still dressed at this hour. The lamp in his room was always the last one in the house to go dark. His forehead rested lightly against the glass. His breath made a small cloud that appeared and vanished. The lightning came and she saw him in profile, jaw set, eyes open, watching the rain fill the garden with the same focused attention he brought to his maps, as though the storm were territory he was trying to understand. "Marcus," he turned. She had been careful since the garrison steps to maintain the choreography, the correct distances, the measured exchanges, the fiction of simple practicality. She had been very deliberate about it. She was standing in the hallway at 2 in the morning in her wrapper, the thunder rolling long and low over the harbour, and he was looking at her with the expression she had no defenses against, the unguarded one, the one that said, "I have not been this frightened since the war, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." Every careful thing she had built stepped aside. She crossed the hallway and stood beside him at the window. Their arms nearly touched. The rain hammered the garden and the lightning came again, a long branching flash that lit every detail in white and silver. The magnolia, the iron fence, the puddles spreading across the stone path, and his face close and turned toward her, every line of it known by now. "There were 12 men in my unit at Petersburg," he said. His voice was quiet enough that only the storm and she could hear it. "I was the only one who walked out." She did not fill the silence. The rain did that. "I have spent every year since then trying to justify it." He was still looking at the garden, but she understood that what he was seeing was something else entirely. A field in Virginia, a particular quality of smoke, 12 faces. "The appointments, the legislation, the schools we are building, I tell myself it adds up to something sufficient." "And at 2 in the morning," she said softly. "It doesn't." He turned and looked at her, not with surprise, with the expression of someone who has said something carefully inexact for years and has just heard another person say the precise thing, the true thing, with no effort at all. "My father wrote to me once," she said. She looked at the rain instead of him because it was easier to say it to the rain. "Before Chickamauga, he said the worst part wasn't being afraid of dying." She paused. It was the fear that the specific people whose opinion mattered most to him would forget the exact shape of who he was. Not his name, not his rank. The shape of him, the way he laughed, the way he smelled like tobacco and cedar on Sunday mornings. Her voice was steady. It cost her something to keep it that way. He said that was what kept him going, not duty, not the cause, the thought of coming home to the people who knew the exact shape of him. The lightning moved behind the clouds, diffuse and silver. "He didn't come home," she said. The rain spoke for a long moment. Then his hand found hers on the window ledge. Not a grasp, a placement. Deliberate. His fingers laid over hers the way a man places a document he is certain of, with full intention and no apology. She looked down at their hands, her pale fingers under his, the rain light washing over both of them, erasing in its democracy all the things the daylight made impossible. "This is," she began. "I know what it is," he said. "I know exactly what it is and what it costs." A pause. "I am not asking you for anything, Eliza. I want you to understand that clearly. I am not asking." She turned her hand over beneath his. Their palms met, the full warmth of it, the specific and irreversible warmth of two people who have decided without ceremony, without announcement, simply with the turning of a hand. "What if I'm not asking you to ask?" she said. The thunder moved, long, low, unhurried. The house settled on its foundation and exhaled. He lifted their joined hands slowly, not quickly, not with the urgency of something seized, but with the gravity of something finally allowed, and pressed her knuckles to his lips, not quite a kiss, a resting. The way a man rests his face in his hands when the thing he has been carrying becomes, at once, too heavy and too precious to hold at arm's length any longer. She felt it travel through her like sound through still water, down through her chest into her ribs, into the backs of her knees. "Don't close your eyes," he whispered. She hadn't realized they had begun to drift closed. She opened them. He was looking at her, wholly, completely, with the specific attention of a man who intends to remember every detail of the moment he is standing inside of. "Don't close your eyes," he said again. "I want you to see this." She saw it, all of it. The rain on the window, the dark hallway with its single candle guttering on the table at the far end, the warmth of his hand in hers, the particular quality of standing at the absolute edge of every rule both of them had ever lived by and choosing, with full clarity, with both eyes open, to step forward anyway. She had believed for a very long time that the most dangerous thing a person could do was feel something they had no practical plan for. She was beginning to understand that the most dangerous thing, the truly most dangerous thing, was to be this close to someone who could see you, the exact shape of you, and to close your eyes against it. She did not close her eyes. By morning, the entire street had formed an opinion. Or rather, by morning, the woman 2 houses down who had been at her upstairs window during the storm had seen 2 silhouettes at the end of the Voss hallway, standing close together in the dark, and had found that this was sufficient material to construct a thorough narrative without needing any additional facts. Eliza discovered it the way she discovered most unpleasant things, immediately, without warning, and with no time to prepare a face for it. She went to the market at 7 in the morning with her basket and her list, and came back at 7:30 with her list, her basket, and 3 separate conversations she had not initiated, each of them circling the same fixed point with the particular southern indirection that managed always to be more precisely cutting than anything said plainly. "How are you managing, Eliza? With the arrangements? Your dear mother must find it so taxing, the disruption to the household. We simply want you to know the Ladies' Society is always available if you find yourself in need of guidance." She set the basket on the kitchen table. She stood very still for a moment. She looked at the basket's contents: flour, salt, 2 eggs from the market woman who had wrapped them carefully in cloth, a small jar of sourwood honey. And she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and permitted herself exactly 10 seconds of something she refused to name. Then she began making biscuits. She was 3 minutes in. Flour measured, lard cut, her hands working the dough with the focused efficiency of a woman who had converted approximately 70% of her emotional life into domestic productivity, when she heard his step on the kitchen stairs. He stopped in the doorway. She did not turn around, but she felt him assess the situation with the same careful attention he brought to dispatches and maps, reading the angle of her shoulders, the pace of her hands, the quality of the silence she was producing. "They saw," she said. She did not make it a question. "I heard." He came further into the room. His boots were quiet on the kitchen floor. "The social implications for you, I am not ashamed of it." Her hands moved through the dough, each press and fold deliberate. "I want to be completely clear on that point." A pause that lasted the length of 2 heartbeats. Then, "Eliza." "What I am," she said, with the careful enunciation of someone handling something fragile, "is afraid." She pressed her palms flat into the dough. "I am afraid of what it costs in this city. I am afraid of Mrs. Dalton and the Ladies' Society and the groups that move through the streets after dark, who have decided that the end of the fighting was an error requiring their personal correction." She stopped working the dough. She turned around, flour on her hands, her expression stripped entirely of its usual management. "I'm afraid that this is something I cannot be practical about, and I have been practical about everything for 7 years, and I do not know how to be otherwise." He was standing 4 feet away. In the morning kitchen light, the plain, honest, unromantic light of a Charleston morning with the harbor smell coming through the window, his face was wholly open. She could see all of it: the weight, the wanting, the absolute bedrock certainty of a man who has stood on the far side of a decision and found it solid under him. "Then don't," he said. "For once in your life, don't be practical." She laughed. It came out broken at the edges, startled and half tearful, and entirely unlike the version of herself she had been maintaining for years. She pressed the back of her floured hand against her mouth. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps. He took her face in both hands, gently, with the extraordinary care of someone touching something they have been afraid, for a long time, of being permitted to touch, and pressed his forehead to hers. They stood there in the flour-dusted kitchen, while the biscuits sat unfinished on the board, and the morning light came through the window, and the street outside decided what it was going to decide, and Eliza closed her hands around his wrists and held on. She felt his pulse beneath her fingers, steady, present. "There are men at the garrison," he said quietly, his voice low against her hair, "who have already submitted formal objections to Colonel Pratt. Complaints about conduct. There will be a review board. There is a possibility of reassignment." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "And if they reassign you?" His thumbs moved along her cheekbones, the faintest pressure, as though he were memorizing the terrain. "Then I will come back," he said. Not as a promise dressed in sentiment, as a statement of logistical intent from a man who had spent his entire adult life navigating systems designed to stop him, and had navigated every single one of them, until he reached the other side. She believed him the way she believed in the harbor, the way she believed in the spring coming back after the kind of winter that makes you doubt it will. The biscuits burned. The smell of them reached the parlor where her mother was sitting with her morning tea, and her mother called from the other room. "Eliza? Something's burning, darling." And they stepped apart, and Eliza pulled the pan from the oven, and Marcus leaned against the kitchen wall with his arms folded and watched her with the smile she had not yet seen in public, the full one. And she threw a dish towel at him, and he caught it, and for a moment, just a moment, the city outside and its opinions and its grief and its shadows did not exist at all. The formal review was convened on the 17th of July in the garrison's main meeting room. Summer in Charleston was a physical presence, not merely weather but substance, a heat that settled on the shoulders like a hand and refused to lift, the air thick with humidity from the marsh, the ceiling fans turning with a slowness that only rearranged the warmth rather than relieving it. The garrison building smelled of old wood and tobacco and the particular staleness of institutional authority. Eliza was not permitted inside the meeting room. She sat on a wooden bench in the corridor outside and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the wall directly across from her. Cream plaster, a water stain near the baseboard shaped roughly like the state of Georgia, and did what she always did when her body wanted to give way to fear. She made an inventory, the number of windows in the corridor, the quality of the light through them, going amber with the afternoon, the sound of her own breathing, which she kept measured and even because it had to be, because it was the only thing she could control. Inside the room, 4 officers sat at a long table. The objections, as Marcus had outlined them to her 2 nights before at the parlor table, both of them sitting with the lamp between them, speaking in the low, factual register they had developed for difficult things, were threefold. The first was conduct unbecoming an officer, the formal allegation of inappropriate personal attachment to a civilian woman in his quarters. False in its most explicit implication, not entirely false in its essential truth, and they had both acknowledged that clearly, without softening it. The second was the matter of judgment compromised by personal entanglement within his district of assignment. This one, he had told her, was the hardest to argue against cleanly. Because it's partially true, he'd said, without self-reproach, simply as fact. I have made no decisions that favor you or your household, but I cannot claim that knowing you has had no effect on how I see this city. She had looked at him across the lamp. Would you change it? He had looked back. No. The third objection, the one that no one had written in clean, bureaucratic language, but that everyone in the room understood, was simply that 2 senior white officers in the 2nd District had spent 3 years watching Marcus Hale outrank them, outperform them, and conduct himself with a discipline that made their own records look like rough drafts, and they had been searching for a lever long enough to move him. This was it. This was what they had been waiting for. Eliza sat with all of this in the corridor and looked at the water stain shaped like Georgia and breathed. She prayed. Not with the formal architecture of Sunday prayer, not with the specific language of the denomination she had been raised in, but the simpler, older version of prayer, the act of directing something outward toward whatever larger intelligence had arranged the world in its current configuration, asking it to arrange this one thing differently. She sat for 3 hours. The door opened. It was Lieutenant Gale who came out first. He was constitutionally incapable of concealing anything. His face was a weather vane, and she had learned to read it months ago. He came through the door and looked down the corridor and found her standing. She had gotten to her feet without consciously deciding to. And his expression said everything before he opened his mouth. He was smiling. Marcus came out a moment later. In public, he wore the composed face, the one that gave nothing away, the one she had learned to look through to find the real expression underneath. He came out with his tunic still precisely buttoned, his bearing entirely correct, and then he looked down the corridor and found her, and something in him, in the set of his shoulders, in the line of his jaw, in the precise controlled infrastructure of that public face, quietly came undone. He walked to her. "A reprimand on record," he said quietly. "No reassignment. The senior officers will appeal to Washington. It will take months. A beat. It will almost certainly go nowhere, she breathed. A long, slow breath, all the way down. Almost certainly, she said. In the army, almost certainly is the best available outcome. His eyes moved over her face, checking, cataloguing, doing the thing he always did. The reprimand is mine alone. It has no formal bearing on your standing or your households. I know, she said. I don't care about my standing. I care about yours, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever I have broken with the full intention of protecting yours. Behind him, 3 feet away, Lieutenant Gale had developed a sudden and consuming interest in the water stain on the baseboard. Marcus, Eliza said, quietly, for him alone. Come home. He looked at her. Everything else, the corridor, the garrison, the record of reprimand, the officers behind the closed door, the city outside with its grief and its social machinery and its shadowy groups and its deciding, fell away, and what was left was simply this. 2 people in a hallway, the distance between them already crossed in every way that mattered, choosing it again in the plain light of a July afternoon, with nothing romantic about the setting and everything essential about the decision. Yes, he said. Summer turned to autumn, and autumn moved through Charleston with the slow, considered grace of something that had arrived at exactly the right time. The punishing heat loosened in stages, first in the mornings, then in the evenings, then at last in the long gold afternoons that smelled of wood smoke from the inland and salt from the harbor, and something else, some particular quality of October light, that made even the wrecked city look as though it were being composed rather than merely endured. Marcus's assignment was extended by 4 months. He did not offer an explanation. She did not ask for one, understanding that in the army there were outcomes that were achieved rather than announced, and that someone, the colonel perhaps or someone higher, had decided that a general who had survived a formal review without losing his post was a general who had demonstrated a useful kind of durability. They were careful in public. They maintained the correct distances, the appropriate formality, the polished fiction of a professional boarding arrangement between an officer and a civilian householder. She remained Miss Voss at church and at the market, and at the garrison dinners she occasionally attended with her mother. He remained General Hale in every context that had witnesses. In the house on Rutledge Avenue, in the evenings, the door between the parlor and the east room stood open. She had been reading aloud to her mother for an hour on the evening of October the 3rd, Jane Eyre, which her mother had always loved, and which Eliza had read so many times she could deliver certain passages from memory with her eyes half closed. Her mother fell asleep in her chair by the fire, the way she did now most evenings, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing evening out into something peaceful. Eliza looked at her for a moment, at the silver of her hair, at the lines that years had put in her face, at the extraordinary dignity she had maintained through everything. And then she looked back at the book and kept reading, because she liked the sound of words in a quiet room, because it was one of the few things she did entirely for herself. She was several pages further in when she became aware that he had stopped writing. She lowered the book slightly and looked toward the doorway. He was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and his ankles loosely crossed below them, wearing the at-home version of himself, the collar open at the top button, the sleeves turned back at the cuffs, the entire composed structure of the public man softened into something that lived only in this house, only in these evenings. He was watching her with an expression she had been privately cataloguing since April, the intermediate one, between the composed public face and the fully open one she'd seen in rainstorms and flour-dusted kitchens, the in-between expression, the one that was only for her. "Don't stop," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the book. She read to the end of the chapter, the scene where Jane stands in the firelight and Mr. Rochester says, "You are no ruin, sir," and she had always found that line unbearably precise. And when she finally set the book down and looked up, he had not moved. He was still watching her with the careful, cataloguing attention of a man who has understood something important and is ensuring it is committed fully to memory. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. He straightened from the doorway. He crossed the parlor with his measured step, past the settee, past the table with the lamp, past the armchair where her mother slept undisturbed, and he came to where she was sitting and did not sit beside her, but crouched down in front of her, bringing himself to her level, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely laced, his face entirely undefended. He was trembling, she realized. Fractionally, the specific, controlled trembling of a man who does not tremble habitually and is not certain what to do with the evidence that he is doing it now. "I have broken approximately 11 regulations in the past 6 months, he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice he used when he was saying the true thing. Attachment to a civilian in my district, fraternization of a personal nature, allowing an entanglement to compromise, he paused. My capacity to form a single impartial judgment about anything in this city, because every judgment I form, I am aware of you. Every decision I make, you are somewhere in the equation." He looked at her steadily. "I am not apologizing for it. I want to be clear about that." She sat very still. "I have never broken a rule in my life," he said, "that I did not believe the breaking of it was right. I broke the rule that said a man like me had no business carrying rank in this army. I broke the rule that said I should stay invisible, take the safe appointments, be grateful for being tolerated." His voice did not rise. It simply became more precise, the way very certain things tend to be precise. "I am telling you that I have thought about this with the same seriousness with which I have thought about every decision that has ever mattered to me. And I am asking you..." He reached into his jacket pocket. The ring was small, plain gold with a single small pearl set flat into the band, unpretentious, chosen with the particular care that produces simplicity rather than arriving at it by default. In the lamplight, it looked like something that had been waiting to be found. "Whether you would be willing," he said, "to break a few rules with me." The October light was in the room, amber and quiet, the kind of light that makes everything look decided. Her mother breathed peacefully in the armchair. The harbor was 2 streets over, doing what it had always done, entirely indifferent to what occurred in the houses beside it. The man in front of her was looking at her with dark eyes she had memorized by accident over 6 months of evenings, holding out a ring and everything it represented. The danger and the social weight and the enmity of neighbors and the appeal to Washington that was still moving through bureaucratic channels, with the absolute open-handed certainty of someone who has calculated the cost and found it acceptable. She had been, above all things, practical. She reached out. She took the ring from his palm and held it for a moment, felt the weight of it, the warmth from where it had been against his body, the small, specific realness of it in her fingers. She turned it once. The pearl caught the lamp. Then she looked at him. "Marcus," she said, "I have been efficient and careful and sensible for 7 years. I have managed every crisis and mended every tear and kept every practical thing standing." The firelight moved. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not entirely dry, and she made no effort to correct that. "I have kept the door to everything I couldn't afford closed for so long that I had almost forgotten what was on the other side of it." She breathed. "I remember now." She put the ring on her own finger. He looked at her hand, then at her face. And the expression that crossed him in that moment, she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe it accurately and never quite managing, because it was the expression of a man who has been, in some fundamental way, held together by discipline for so long that the moment it is no longer the only thing holding him, he doesn't collapse but expands, fills outward into the full shape of himself, and it is enormous and quiet and entirely without performance. He lifted her hand and pressed it against his lips, not the reverent, careful gesture from the rainy night, not the tentative offering of a man still asking permission, but something fully arrived, fully certain, the gesture of a man who is no longer on the outside of what he has. She felt it in her fingertips, in her chest, in the long, locked room. "Don't close your eyes," she said. He looked up from her hand. "I want you to see this too," she said. "All of it, eyes open." He rose from the crouch and sat beside her on the settee, properly beside her, his shoulder against hers, their hands still joined, the ring warm on her finger. He looked at her with the full, open face, the smile she had been collecting in private since May, the one that used every part of him and made the scar at his temple catch the light like a mark of distinction rather than damage. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his cheek on her hair. In the armchair across the room, her mother slept. The fire spoke in small, calm syllables. The harbor was out there in the dark, still and enormous and ancient, moving on its own tides. And in the house on Rutledge Avenue, two people who had started as a bureaucratic arrangement, an officer, a householder, a standard rate of compensation, sat in the lamplight with their hands laced together and let everything they had been carefully not feeling take up at last the space it had always deserved. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was a laundry day, which meant Eliza's hands were damp when she took it from the postal boy's hand, and the paper immediately began to soften slightly at the edges, which annoyed her because it was from Washington and she would want to keep it. Marcus was in the garden. He had taken to the garden the way he took to everything he decided mattered, with methodical attention, unhurried patience, and a complete disregard for whether a Union general was supposed to know the precise angle at which a cutting should be set into the soil for maximum root development. He had learned to grow things. The wisteria on the east garden wall had, by the second spring of their marriage, become something the neighbors noted with an admiration they sometimes managed to deliver without resentment. Marcus. She stood on the back porch steps with the letter. He came up from the garden rows with soil on his hands and his shirt loosened at the collar, the at-home version of himself, the one that belonged only to this house, only to her, and read over her shoulder. His chin rested lightly against her hair. His arms came around her from behind, encircling her and the letter both, the way he held things he intended to keep. The letter was from a congressman he had been in correspondence with for 2 years. A measured, strategic, months-long campaign conducted through official channels with the patience of a man who had learned that the surest route through a wall was the one that did not announce itself as an assault. The letter confirmed what they had been working toward. 3 new schools in the district, permanent bureau offices in Charleston, funding secured, protections written into the agreement. 3 schools. He was quiet for a long moment. She felt his chest expand against her back. 3, she said. 3. His arms tightened slightly. The Charleston school opens in September. There's a building on King Street. The bureau has already surveyed it. She looked at the letter, at the signature, at the official seal, at the proof of a thing that had been impossible and was now, in the plain language of a government document, simply a fact. She thought about 12 men at Petersburg, about a horse that came home without her father, about a house on Rutledge Avenue that had been falling apart in all the places no one was allowed to look, and a man who had come to its door in April of 1868 and looked at every one of those places directly and not looked away. September, she said. September, he confirmed. From inside the house, from the East Room, which had not been only his room for 2 years, and which now contained, in addition to the desk and the maps and the books and the ring in its small box on the shelf, a crib that Marcus had assembled himself over the course of one extremely focused Saturday, while Eliza supervised from the doorway, came a sound. Small, insistent, newly discovered, and enormously pleased with its own capability. They turned together. Ruth, 9 months old, named for Eliza's grandmother, in possession of her father's dark eyes and her mother's expression of unhurried, unimpressible assessment, had pulled herself upright against the doorframe of the East Room and was standing there on uncertain legs, gripping the wood, regarding the world with the focused concentration of someone who has just arrived at the threshold of a significant accomplishment. Marcus was across the porch and through the door before Eliza had finished drawing her next breath. He crouched on the parlor floor 3 feet from his daughter, his soil-damp hands open. "Come on," he said softly. "You have it. Come on." Ruth looked at him. She looked at her own grip on the doorframe. She looked at the 3 feet of floor between them with the expression of someone performing a full tactical assessment. Then she let go. 1 step, 2, 3, unsteady, concentrated, her small face set with the absolute commitment of a person who has decided to do a thing and has given the decision everything. And then she walked directly into his open hands with a sound of pure, uncomplicated triumph. Eliza pressed both hands over her mouth. Marcus lifted his daughter, stood, and Ruth immediately seized his face in both hands, proprietary, certain of her welcome, exactly as she always did. And he laughed. The full laugh. The one Eliza had first heard in the flour-dusted kitchen, and had been secretly, carefully collecting ever since. The one that used every part of him and needed no occasion, only this. His daughter in his arms, his wife on the back porch, the wisteria on the east wall coming into its third spring, and the letter from Washington folded in her hand. He turned and found her eyes across the room. She looked at him over the tops of her hands. Don't close your eyes. She hadn't. Not once. Not for a single second of any of it. Not the rain, not the garrison corridor, not the October lamplight, not the long, quiet years of building something in the rubble of an old world that had never imagined what they were capable of. She had kept her eyes open, every rule broken, every wall crossed, every morning of it earned. And it had been, from the very beginning, exactly worth it. This channel tells stories of love that refuse to surrender to the world around it. If this story moved you, if you felt Marcus and Eliza's journey from the very first rainy night to that last morning in the garden, leave a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. Every single one is made for you.
I learned to stand where the fire burns low, where men don't speak of the things that they know. I carried silence like armor on skin. The war never ends, it just settles within. They gave me orders, I follow them through. Life made of rules I could always hold true, but none of those lines, none of those chains prepared me for you or the weight of your name. You saw the cracks I buried deep, the parts of me I couldn't keep. I was built from war, from dust and command, from nights with blood I couldn't wash from my hands. I never bent, I never broke through until I stood in front of you. Oh, and every rule I swore I'd defend fell to pieces the moment you let me in. I fought the world, I fought what I knew, but I lost that war when I chose you. They told me distance would keep you safe, that love is a risk I could never take. But your voice in the dark, your hand in the rain, made every warning feel hollow and vain. I saw the fear that you tried to hide, the strength in your silence you wore like pride. And somewhere between the lines we drew, I stopped being a soldier and became someone new. No battlefield could make me fall, but your touch undid it all. I was built from war, from steel and scars, from broken nights and forgotten stars. I held the line, I carried truth, but I dropped it all when I reached for you. Oh, and every law that defined my name turned into ash in a single flame. I face the past, I face what's true, but I lost that war when I chose you. If they come for me, let them come. I've already lived what I've become, a man who stands with nothing left except the love he won from death. I don't need rank, I don't need fame. them judge,
let them choose,
let them choose.
let them choose.
I've already lived what I could lose. And if I fall as truth, because I won my life when I chose you.